Professors FM.
I'm Bridget Stomberg.
And I'm Lisa DeSimone.
And this is Taxes for the Masses.
Today's episode is on a recent tax conference I had the pleasure of hosting at the University of Texas.
Every 2 years, the universities of Texas and Waterloo combine forces to host a tax research conference. This year's conference took place in Austin, Texas, and featured papers with diverse topics, ranging from how media bias could impact how the press covers the tax and accounting-related misconduct of firms, to the role of increased tax transparency efforts in reducing multinational tax avoidance, to how we as individuals save, to how recent tax provisions around renewable energy and R&D have impacted real investments of firms. In today's episode, we discuss two of the papers presented in more detail. Hello, Lisa.
Hey, B.
Today's episode is on the UT Waterloo conference, which you just hosted, and I am as curious as anyone because I wasn't able to attend, and so I'm depressed because if I'm doing my math correctly, I think this is the second episode we've done about a conference where only one of us has been there, because the way it works, Illinois is every other year, UT Waterloo is every other year.
Yep.
So we have now each missed a September conference in the past 2 years. I give that a thumbs down.
It's 2 thumbs down. Yes, it was a bummer. So you couldn't come because you had a big celebration going on, if I remember correctly.
I part celebration, part meeting. So I am the faculty chair of our undergrad program, and so Friday was meetings, and then an induction of our first year class. And that is why I could not attend the conference. Meetings, and then a celebration.
Well, that doesn't sound like nearly as much fun as the conference.
That was my thought, but please confirm my suspicion and tell me how wonderful the conference was.
It was pretty great. We had about 80 participants from all around the world. Most of us were tax accountants, but a few economists thrown in for a good measure. We had 5 papers with 5 discussants, and it was a pretty diverse range of papers, as you explained at the top of the episode, and a diverse range of discussants too. And I just want to give a shout out to John Schwartz, who joined us from our School of Journalism to talk about media bias. So he's not an accountant. He is not a tax person. He is not an archival researcher like we are. And his discussion was amazing because he gave exactly the perspective that we needed, which was how do newsrooms actually operate. So it was really interesting. He was very funny, and it was super informative. It was a really great discussion.
That's awesome.
Some other highlights, after we broke for the day, we had a break between the last session and dinner, and about 25 brave souls agreed to join me in the classroom to learn how to dance the Texas two-step.
Oh my. I
brought in a real instructor. This wasn't just me showing people how I try to pretend that I can dance. So we brought in a real instructor, and we all danced together and learned some of the basic moves. And then there was a group that hit a real honky tonk bar after dinner that night to go show off their skills.
Very impressive.
Yeah.
Nice.
Of course, you probably are glad that you did not come because there's no way I could have gotten you onto the dance floor.
Nope. But I would have happily watched from the sidelines.
Yeah, watching isn't as fun. You gotta get your feet wet. You gotta participate.
No, thank you. Didn't do it in 4 years in the PhD program. Not going to start now.
Fair enough. The last thing I'll say is that we have discussed rebranding our conference. So we alternate hosting it with University of Waterloo, and we only ever have the conference every other year. So every 4 years it's in Waterloo. Every 4 years it's in Texas. And so we are thinking of calling the one that was this year the Summer Tax Research Olympics. To alternate with the Winter Tax Research Olympics. And it aligns with the actual Olympics and the respective weather in the fall in Austin versus Waterloo.
I'm behind this. Are we going to give out medals?
Oh, all we've talked about so far is the name.
Okay, I'm all in if we're going to hand out medals. Interesting fact.
Okay.
I've never been to a UT Waterloo conference.
Yeah, that's just depressing.
All right, so enough about all the fun I missed. Let's talk about the research that I missed. Let's talk about the papers.
So the first paper I want to talk about is called The Initial Effect of the Inflation Reduction Act on Local Business Activities. And I want to talk about it because it's by your former PhD student, Stefan Richter, who's now at the University of Illinois. And his co-author, Ben Oswald, presented the paper at the conference.
So since I was not able to see the presentation, I can at least contribute by giving some background on the Inflation Reduction Act. Can that be my job here today?
Very reasonable.
So we have a whole episode on the Inflation Reduction Act. I really like the episode. I don't like to play favorites, but I think that's a good one. So if you need a little bit of a refresher, you can go back and listen to that episode. But just as a quick reminder, the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022, it's Biden's signature tax legislation. And it included a lot of money for renewable energy development. Almost $400 billion, to be exact, was directed at the supply side. So at companies making renewable energy investments. And that's on top of incentives for households, individual taxpayers like you and me. Okay, so examples are production and investment tax credits for wind and solar that tie tax incentives to the amount of clean energy produced or to the amount of qualified investments made. And so the production credit obviously is tied to production. The investment credit is tied to investment. These aren't new credits, but they haven't always been renewed every year. Congress likes to let things expire. And one of the focus is on inequity. The goal was to increase investment in locales with high unemployment or otherwise economically disadvantaged communities called, quote, energy communities in the bill. So that is what I know about, let's see, the title of the paper was the Inflation Reduction Act on Local Business Activities. So I did the first part, and now I'm assuming you're going to tell me that they talked about how that affected local business activities.
They did indeed. Yeah, they actually had two questions that they ask in the paper, and I think they're both really important questions. So the first is, what characteristics are predictive of a firm announcing a clean energy investment following the Inflation Reduction Act? So a determinants model, if you will, a predictive model of like what needs to be in place, what is the magic recipe for companies actually announcing these investments. And so they find that larger counties with more pre-existing business establishments are more likely to have these announcements. That makes sense because if it's a larger community, then, you know, there are more companies there likely that are able to do this investment. And they also found that higher unemployment rates were positively associated with these investments, which is one of the intents of the act. So that's kind of good. However, there was no evidence that these so-called energy communities got any more investment or that there was any bias with respect to how the county had leaned politically in the prior presidential election, which is a little interesting because there's some prior work that demonstrates that these types of federal incentives do tend to vary in their effectiveness depending on whether that county swings Republican or Democrat.
Okay, so you said it. Oftentimes when there is a new tax policy, a paper is sort of organized in two stages. The first is looking at who took advantage of the policy, and it seems like that's what this question was covered. And then there's usually what we would refer to as like a consequences test where we're trying to say, did it work? So did business establishments go up in locations where these investments were announced?
Yeah, the paper finds that there's about almost a 0.5 point to a 1.3% increase in county level business establishments. So these are new establishments, like a new restaurant or a new office building, a new production facility. The increase in establishments, though, is concentrated in counties with below median unemployment rates. And that's a little interesting because the answer to that first question that we'd already talked about was that it was those counties with higher unemployment rates that had more announced clean energy investments. But if we go to look at the actual outcome of this in the form of business establishments, those are only happening in counties with lower unemployment.
Interesting. So again, we've talked about this before, but typically at conferences, one of the authors will present the paper, and then there's a discussant who's not an author on the paper who tries to give the author some really constructive feedback and maybe points out some of these results that perhaps look counterintuitive, at least on their face. So who was the discussant on this paper, and what were some of the things that they highlighted?
We had a fantastic discussant for this paper. It was my very own PhD student, Caitlin Krager, who will be searching for academic positions this year. She did a great job of creating a starting point for our discussion, because after she presented her thoughts, we had a long conversation, a Q&A between the audience and the authors. So she brought up concerns around some confounding events. So the Inflation Reduction Act wasn't really the only thing that had been going on over the past year. Some issues with how they try to estimate the effects that they get. And in particular, suggested that they look at not just new business establishments, because that's like a really big deal. That's like starting a brand new business, right? Or expanding into an entirely new office area. Whereas if you just look at expansions in the form of increased employment, maybe they might find some smaller but still incremental investments being made as a result of these clean energy incentives. Let's see, what else did she talk about? Apparently there's actually been a lot of delays. So the paper focuses on investments that are announced. It's a company saying, oh, we intend to make this investment. But the Financial Times ran an article recently talking about how most of those announced investments haven't actually occurred yet. They've been delayed quite a bit. So that might be something going on here too with their way of trying to estimate whether the incentive is having an impact on local economic activity. Is like if the investment has only been announced but hasn't actually had the investment take place yet, then would we really expect to see an increase in business activity?
That's a great point. And I'm imagining they're starting where they're starting because of data availability.
Yeah, although I think that's a real strength of the paper is some of the data that they've cobbled together, not only on these announcements, but on the county level characteristics and business activity that's already in place. I think the authors have done a really nice job of putting together some cool data sets to even begin to answer these questions.
Nice. So overall take?
I think it's a really interesting paper. It's a quick paper. It's a quick analysis in the sense that we only had the Inflation Reduction Act in place in 2022 and we're only in 2024. And those of us who are archival researchers, that's fast for us. We usually don't have good data for a few years to try to tackle these questions. So I think it's a really important and interesting paper that tries to get at knowing the answer of the effectiveness of this policy pretty quickly.
Very cool. Should we move on to paper number 2?
Yeah. So the second paper I wanted to talk about is called The Effect of Tax Incentives and Account Aggregation on Private Savings Decisions. And this is an experimental paper by Davidson Gillette, Shane Stinson, and Marcus Doxey. And Shane was the person who presented it at our conference. And I have to say, I love Shane's work.
Nice.
It's so cool. He's done a lot in this space around constructing experiments to figure out how tax policies should be designed to encourage individuals to save for things like retirement, and how do we get them to save the most. And so a lot of his earlier work compares the currently taxed versus deferred tax types of retirement plans. So for an individual retirement plan, IRA, or an employer-sponsored plan like a 401k, they often come in two different flavors. One where you get a deduction now for what you put in, and then you're taxed when you take it out in retirement. And so that's the deferred tax plan. And then the alternative is you could forego the deduction on what you put in, and so you're taxed on that income now. But then when you remove those funds in retirement, you don't pay a tax on what you remove. And that's the currently taxed plan. And his prior work has shown that even though mathematically you're indifferent between these two types of plans. So if we have the right set of assumptions, you don't care whether it's currently taxed or deferred tax. However, behaviorally, we're more likely to save more in a currently taxed plan.
Interesting.
Part of the reason is that when I'm looking at how much I have in that account and it's a deferred tax plan, meaning I'm going to be taxed on it in retirement when I withdraw from it, I don't fully incorporate the taxes when I look at that account balance. So I think I have more money than I actually do.
Yeah.
Because for every dollar I take out, I'm going to give some percentage to the government. And so I undersave relative to the current tax plan. And I just think that type of work is incredibly informative for tax policy.
Yeah. And what you just said is what we love out of experimental papers, because it's a result that is interesting and logical when you take a step back and think about it.
So the other thing that he layers into this paper, he still works, or they, I should say, still work with the current tax versus deferred tax distinction of retirement savings. The other factor is that we have a lot of different types of accounts that we can save in that the government gives us tax incentives to encourage us to save for. So I already mentioned those retirement accounts, but we also have 529s. Those are college savings accounts. We also have health savings accounts to help you save for any medical issues that you have. And all of these types of accounts give you tax benefits, but they're in different accounts with different code sections associated with them and different rules, and you have to administer them differently. And so there's been a movement to say, let's just combine these all. Let's simplify everything. And we'll just have one universal savings account, or USA, which is kind of cute in terms of how it's named. And that's all you get for retirement, for college, for medical, whatever. You're just going to have one account, and we're going to make things easy peasy. And so the question that this paper asks is that actually going to encourage people to save more?
And what did they find?
No, it's a very bad idea.
Really? Okay. It sounded good.
The problem is that we want to keep, so this is a behavioral theory, that we want to keep track of what we've earmarked certain funds for. So we just have one, this is mental accounting theory.
Yeah.
It's, we earmark funds for certain things. The problem is we're bad at it. So we tend to, with a bonus that you get, you're like, ooh, I'm going to pay off that debt that I had. But then you're also thinking, ooh, I'm going to use this bonus to go buy myself a treat. And you end up like double spending. Yeah. Quadruple spending your bonus.
Yes.
Same sort of thing can happen here if we just have one savings account that's supposed to be for retirement and college and healthcare. We're actually much better keeping track of these things in separate accounts. We will save more if we do that.
Very, very interesting.
So when you combine that with the current tax versus deferred tax, basically the best scenario that the government can offer us, the one where they'll get the most savings based on these series of experiments that Shane and his co-authors have run, is the separate accounts. So we want all these different buckets for the different savings goals that we have. And we want them to be currently taxed. So don't give us a deduction for them now, but let us have that money tax-free when we go to the account to withdraw it.
That's very interesting. Now, if only anybody in Congress would read and listen to these suggestions.
Yeah. Good luck with that.
So sounds like a good paper. Sounds like you really liked it. Who was the discussant on this paper, and what did they have to say?
Yeah, so we had Tisha King from University of Waterloo give an excellent discussion on this paper. She brought up some interesting alternative behavioral theories that she thought the authors could work into the part of the paper where they try to talk about why people behave and make decisions that they do. So I thought that was pretty interesting to hear about. And then she had some good suggestions for additional experiments that they could run likely in future work.
Nice. I do have another question. It might be a little controversial.
Ooh, you're getting spicy on me.
So I'm assuming from the list of papers that I looked at that this was the only experimental paper in the conference.
You are correct.
So I'm then further assuming that most of the audience was comprised of archival researchers.
Yes, it was. I invited experimentalists. They just didn't come. So it was mostly archivalists.
And I don't blame them.
Hey.
So, no, I will say I went to a behavioral conference one time. So it was an archival person, and they were lovely and very nice, supportive, engaged people. How did our team do? Was the audience engaged and asking questions and into it?
They were super into it. We actually ran out of time to ask questions. So there was a lot of audience participation, even though most of them were not experimentalists, as B said. And so Andrew Belknap, my colleague here at University of Texas, was moderating the session. And at a certain point, he looked at the clock and he was like, man, I see like 10, 15 hands up and we only have 10 minutes left. And so he said, I'm taking over. We're going to do rapid fire questions, just the questions, so that the authors could hear what questions and comments people had. And then just a couple minutes at the end for the author to respond to whatever he wanted to respond to, which made me turn to Ken and say, you can take the man out of UNC, but you cannot take UNC out of the man. I'm going to let you explain that one. You're nodding as if you know what the heck I'm talking about.
I am nodding because as soon as you said it, that was the first thought that went through my head. So UNC hosts a very renowned tax conference. I think they've been doing it for 25 years. And that is how Q&A is set up, because there are so many questions. Everybody's read the paper. Everybody is really engaged, that you just put up your name tag saying you have a question. And it's just, as an author, you stand there and get 30, 40, 50 questions thrown at you in a 15-minute period of time. And then you really don't have any time to respond to any of them. So it's kind of best of both worlds. You get a lot of feedback as an author, and you don't have to worry about having a really great response on your feet. Well, it sounds like a success all around, notwithstanding the two-step. So I'm sorry I missed it.
I'm sorry you missed it too.
Maybe, 2028 will be my year.
Summer Tax Research Olympics 2028. B's going for gold.
I'll be there. All right, it's time for the good, the bad, and the ugly, and I'm just gonna pout because I missed it. So I don't have anything good to say. I'm sad.
Yeah, it was, you missed out. It was a good conference. It was cool papers. I think the papers had pretty interesting takeaways. Several of them were very policy relevant. So,
which I love.
I'm bummed. Yeah, I'm bummed you missed it.
I love a good policy relevant paper. Sorry to miss my PhD student presenting at a major conference. It was generally no bueno. Ugly. What do you got? Anything?
We got to wait 2 years before we can do it all over again up in Waterloo.
Yeah. But fortunately, if the stars align, we will see each other next September in Chicago.
I don't know. Our track record is terrible, so I am not counting on it.
I'm not either, and things happen in threes, and so maybe. But I'm gonna hold out hope. I'm gonna hold out hope. It's just the fall really stinks.
The fall is tough.
Yeah, teaching and.
I will say, I will add an ugly to that, which is that organizing a conference the second week of my teaching semester was maybe not the most brilliant of ideas I've ever had.
I can only imagine, but on behalf of all of the authors and discussants and participants who got to benefit from the conference, thank you, because it is not easy, but I'm sure people loved it, and it is it's an important outlet for people to showcase their work. So thank you for all your work to get that done while teaching and being senior editor at JETA and co-hosting a podcast with me.
Man, I'm tired just hearing you say all that. Well, that's all we have time for today.
Be sure to join us for more tax nerdery on future episodes of Taxes for the Masses.